In many ways, Kinnah Gimel, Below Zayif Giyum Ve'Lilu V'nai, is an introduction to Kinnos in general. It touches on many of the themes that we'll see develop much more fully in later Kinnos, both at night and then the day of Tisha B'Av as well. The Kinnah starts, and its refrain is centered around two psukim. The first, again reading the Kinnah, Below Zayif Giyum Ve'Lilu V'nai. On this night, weep and wail, my children. For on this night, my holy temple was destroyed, and my palaces were burnt down. And this latter part of this half stanza comes from Divrei Yamim Beis, all the way at the end, Perek Lamavav, Pasuk Kites, where recording what the Babylonians did to Jerusalem says, "V'yisrafu es Beis Elokim, v'yinatzu es chomas Yerushalayim." They burnt the house of God. They knocked down the walls of Jerusalem. V'chol amroseh sarfu ba'esh, and they burnt all of its palaces in fire. V'chol klei machamada alashkis, and destroyed all of its treasures. This was of course a national tragedy of devastating proportions, the final nail in the coffin of Judea, and the beginning of the exile, the Babylonian exile. Not to the beginning of the Babylonian exile, but really the end, the finishing, the almost complete emptying out of Jews from the land of Israel to Babylonia. This should be contrasted with the next part of the stanza, the next part of the refrain. And the entire house of Israel shall lament over my agony. And they should bewail the conflagration, right, the burning that God ignited. So this here, the second part of the pasuk refers to a different event, not the destruction of the Beis Mikdash, but actually one that happened at the beginning of the building, at the dedication, I should say, of the first Mikdash, not really the Mikdash, but the dedication of the Mishkan. It refers to the death of Aaron's sons. So again, what happened at that time? So the sons of Aaron perform some sort of sin. Exactly what it is, of course, is a discussion amongst Chazal. But for whatever it was, they were burnt. Right? Nadav and Avihu were burnt by God, and that caused, as you can imagine, much mourning. In fact, however, Hashem through Moshe tells Aaron and his remaining sons not to cry, right? Not to mourn. So the pasuk says instead, "V'achechem kol beis Yisrael yifku es hasreifa asher saraf Hashem." You, Aaron, right, Elazar, Isamar, you need to continue with the dedication of the Mishkan, the dedication of the tabernacle, the service that has to be performed within, and let the house of Israel cry over your loss. Let them cry over the conflagration, over the burning that Hashem ignited. Again, we see here at the extreme, right, at the dedication of the first Mishkan, the first tabernacle, first place, as it were, that God came down to dwell amongst His people. A national tragedy in that these two leaders, Nadav and Avihu, were killed. But also a very personal tragedy that was undergone by Aaron and his remaining sons, having lost their son and their brothers. As we go on in the Kinnos, we'll see that we have expansions of both of these. We'll see, on the one hand, national tragedy, speaking from a national scale, exile, destruction, and so on and so forth, but also personal. What happened to the son and daughter of Rabbi Yishmael, right? What happened to individuals? What happened to Yoshiyahu? And in addition, we'll see a time for mourning, like Yirmiyahu does through Eicha, but also a time for action. Sometimes mourning is inappropriate, like it was for Aaron and his sons. Sometimes it's not enough, or it's not correct to sit in the corner and cry. Sometimes actions need to take their place. Going on to the four stanzas of the Kinnah, again Kinnah Gimel, so we see four different themes, again, each of which will be expanded on by later Kinnos. So the first stanza, which starts below Zet Yalal Mar An Yonech Teles, on this night the impoverished abandoned one shall wail bitterly, speaks of Bnei Israel as God's daughter. A daughter who's been kicked out of the house. It's interesting to note this theme of fire, and that the daughter of a Kohen who commits adultery is punished by fire, as opposed to the daughter of a regular Yisrael. In addition, we find a quotation of Ve'esh Yatsa Me'es Hashem, right? And a fire came out from God on Tisha B'Av, of course, to unfortunately destroy the two Batei Mikdash. But the pasuk itself comes from the fire that came out and destroyed and consumed the followers of Korach, the 250 men who brought incense when they were not supposed to. These people, as it were, these people, the followers of Korach, they were trying to show how close they were to God, right? That they were God's chosen. They can perform this such an important and central service, and therefore, be close to God. But it was a fake. It was wrong. In fact, they rebelled against Moshe Rabbeinu himself. How can such people be close to God? Right? They were, as it were, pretending to be close to God. And so to Bnei Israel, we see in Malachi, for example, that Bnei Israel brought karbanos, they brought sacrifices by the end of the first temple period, but they were sick, they were lame. The animals brought as sacrifices. The act is as if they were caring, the act is as if they were close to God, but in fact they weren't. And so that's what happens here in this first stanza. Bnei Israel pretend, as it were, to be God's daughter, to be close to Him, but in fact they're not, and they're exiled from His house. The second stanza looks at Bnei Israel as God's beloved. And so here we see a number of different connections to the relationship between man and wife. So for example, in the second stanza it says, she was forced to drink bitter waters, and her belly was bloated. Of course, this is what happens to a sota who is guilty. This is what happens to a woman who's been accused by her husband of having an affair, and in fact, it turns out to be true. Right? So he takes her to the Beis Mikdash, he takes her to the temple, and she has to drink mayim ha'ma'orim. She drinks the bitter waters. If she's guilty, then her stomach bloats. Her stomach, as the word, blows up, and that's in fact what happens here. Bnei Israel are guilty of infidelity to God, and therefore are punished. Furthermore, it says V'sholcha mibeisa, right? So she, Bnei Israel, in this case, V'sholcha mibeisa, she's divorced. She's sent away from her husband. Further, Gedola sina me'is asher ahiva, greater was the hatred, more than the original love. And this, of course, this pasuk comes from the story of Amnon and Tamar. Amnon, the son of David HaMelech, the son of King David, desired his half-sister Tamar, and when he finally has his way with her, he hates her. Again, we see, as it were, a marital type relationship. In this case, a skewed relationship, but one that was originally of love, or in the case of Amnon, it was of lust, which becomes one of hatred. And unfortunately, on Tisha B'Av, that's what happens to Bnei Israel. God loved us initially, but through the events of Tisha B'Av, it demonstrates hate. And finally, Bnei Israel referred to Chamanus Chayus Ki Isha Ne'azava, and she is like a widow of the living, like an abandoned woman. And that's again what happens. Right? We are left. Right? God leaves us. We can't stay with Him. We don't have Him anymore. He goes away, and so the poor woman, us, we're like a widow in that we don't have a husband. But our husband's not dead. He's still around, so we can't get remarried. It's like an aguna. And so we see again this second stanza really emphasizing the relationship between God and Bnei Israel as that between a man and his wife. But in that relationship and through this second stanza, we also see hope for the future, and this is something else that we'll see throughout the Kinnos. And so again, it says below right at the beginning of the stanza, on this night the calendrical cycle turns to an inauspicious date. Both the first and second temple were destroyed. on Tisha B'Av. But the truth is, you know what? There was a second temple, and if there was a second temple, there could also be a third temple, right? So the fact that it's not just one and done gives us hope that the temple can be rebuilt, that God can again return to earth, can dwell in our midst. Going on further, and the rebellious daughter, Basa Shaviva, is still unworthy of compassion, right? Lo Ruchama. Lo Ruchama was also the name of Hoshea's daughter. So if you remember to the first chapter of the book of Hosea, so Hosea is told by God to take a wife who's a prostitute and has 3 children with her, though it's almost as it were impossible to tell whether they're actually from Hosea or not. And the names are they're given very strange names because it's prophetic, according to the Rambam, it's a prophetic dream, but it's a prophetic command by God. And the daughter is called Lo Ruchama. Right, the daughter is called there's no mercy. Right, Hashem will not have mercy on Bnei Israel, just like perhaps Hosea should not have mercy on his children because they perhaps are not his. But of course, Hosea does have mercy on these children, and Hashem has mercy on us. And so later in Hosea, Lo Ruchama becomes Ruchama. Right, she attains mercy, and so even the invocation of Lo Ruchama suggests the fact that that can transform into Ruchama. Going further, right, right, a woman may be divorced from her husband, but as long as the woman doesn't marry someone else in between, she can come back to him, right? He can remarry her. And so as long as we, in Galus, as long as Bnei Israel, in our exile, don't assimilate, don't apostatize, right, we can go back to God, right? He'll take us back. We have to work at it. We have to beg for His mercy, but being sent away doesn't mean that we're sent away forever, as long as we stay loyal to Him. And then finally, we have Almanus Chayus Kisha Ne'azava, that we Bnei Israel are living as it were as a widow with a husband who's alive, but not here. So that of course invokes the Rashi on the first paragraph of Shir Shirim. So Rashi reads Shir Shirim, the entire Song of Songs, as a woman who has lost her husband, but he's still alive, and he'll eventually come back to her. And she's looking back through the Song of Shir Shirim and saying how wonderful it used to be, but how terrible it is now because he's gone. But he's going to come back, and that's what happens at the end of Shir Shirim. God comes back to us, and that will happen here as well. And that's finally, emphasized most by the last section by the last fragment in the verse, which says, "V'tomer Tzion azavani Hashem," and Zion says, "Hashem has abandoned me," and that's true, as it were. Right? He's not with us anymore. The temple has been destroyed. God has gone away. But the pasuk itself comes from Isaiah, and in fact we read it the second Shabbos after Tisha B'Av, and the pasuk goes, "V'tomer Tzion azavani Hashem," and Hashem immediately replies, "It's not true." Right? "Hatishkach isha ula merachem ben bitna." Right? Will a woman ever forget her nursing child? Right? Even these will be forgotten. Right? A mother will, as it were, even forget her own child, but God will never forget Bnei Israel. So, V'tomer Tzion azavani Hashem, again, it's true on Tisha B'Av, but all you need to do is read the rest of the pasuk to find comfort. If we go now to the third stanza of Kinnah Gimel, we find yet another theme, which is the connection between the natural world, the spiritual world, and the historical world. So, on this night I was blackened, and the luminaries turned black. Right, I was blackened because of the loss of the Mikdash. I was blackened because already my spiritual level was so low, and the loss of the temple makes it even lower, makes me even darker. But at the same time, that affects the physical world around us. The Oros themselves, the stars, the sun, the moon, darken because of the loss of the Mikdash. The natural order has gone a whack. Right, the natural order is not orderly anymore, not as orderly as it was because of the destruction of the temple. Right, so right, because of this loss of the Mikdash, and specifically because of the loss of the Mishmaros, the regular like clockwork changing of the guard in the temple. So then we see the continuation of this theme of darkness. So I've been surrounded by troubles, by darkness and trouble. And at that point, as it were, so there's five decrees, tragic decrees that are that are meted out on Israel. Again, so now we see history coming into play, and so this is the connection that the Mekonen, that the author of the Kinnah is making, is one between the spiritual level, the destruction of the Beis Mikdash, right, the natural order, and then the historical order, which are intertwined. And we see this, as it were, like right away when Tisha B'Av first started. Originally, when the spies came back and gave their negative report on the land of Israel, so Bnei Israel the Jews wept without purpose, and that was established forever. That for generations, that it would be a night of weeping, and so, as it were, because the night was stamped, right? That time of the year was stamped with tragedy, and as it were, the sun and the moon and the stars and the menorahs, they remember, because those are our calendars as well, and so they remember that every year this is in a time of year that's ripe for tragedy. And so we see that tragedy through history, and so that's how throughout our history, and so that's how the spiritual connection, right, our spiritual loss when the spies come back, our unwillingness to then enter the land of Israel, right, affects the natural order. It has its stamp on the natural world around it, and that natural world then plays the role of history, because it is our clock. It is what tells us time. Then finally, if you go to the fourth stanza, so there we have history itself. On this night, these five terrible things that are listed in the Mishnah and Tanis occurred, and so that is simply history, right? That's simply the recollection of all of the evil events, all the tragic events that occurred to us on Tisha B'Av. It is a day that troubles cling to. In fact, it gets so bad. The last line in the stanza, right? Arise, for this is the day that Hashem has said. That pasuk was originally stated by Devorah, energizing Barak to arise and fight against Sisera, to fight against the evil general. And now our enemies are using it against us, right? So on the night of Tisha B'Av, that's what happens. Even a pasuk, as it were, so positive that it leads to this great salvation at the time of Devorah, becomes the enemies are saying, Hashem, it's time for Hashem has commanded us on this night, on Tisha B'Av, to go attack, right? To go cause troubles, to go cause tragedy to Bnei Israel. And so we see, as we go through Kinnos, we'll see these themes come up again and again, right? The Bnei Israel, as it were, as a daughter of Hashem, and that relationship, Bnei Israel as God's beloved, the spousal relationship, the connection between the natural world, the history, and the spiritual world, and finally history itself and the events that occurred on Tisha B'Av.